His wife made him cook dinner for her and her new boyfriend, and she did it inside a restaurant he silently owned. Not a man who would snap, not a man who would beg. A quiet man, 52 years old, steady hands, 22 years of swallowed pride, handed an apron at the service entrance of a building where his money was in the walls, his name was on the contracts, and the bottle of spirits his wife's boyfriend, raised in a toast, was sitting in that dining room because he put it there. She thought she was humiliating him. She had no idea she was standing in the middle of everything he owned. What happens when a man who has been treated like the help is revealed to be the one holding the deed? Not just to the building, but to the entire world his wife built her new life inside of. If this story is already doing something to your chest, hit that like button right now and subscribe so you never miss what we drop next. These stories come out multiple times a week and every single one delivers. And before we go any further, drop your city in the comments. Where are you watching from today? Let us know you're here. Now let me take you back to where this started, to a Friday evening in Atlanta, a private dining room at a restaurant called Ember and Oak, and a man who arrived through the service entrance wearing a plain jacket, carrying nothing, already knowing something he had not yet decided to use. The service entrance of Ember and Oak was around the back, past the dumpsters, through a door that didn't have a handle on the outside. Pamela was waiting there when Calvin pulled up. She was dressed for the dining room. Cream blouse, gold earrings, the perfume she saved for occasions that mattered. She looked at Calvin's plain dark jacket and said nothing about it. She just pushed the door open and said, "The kitchen staff will show you where everything is. Brandon likes his salmon with a light crust. Don't over-season it." Calvin nodded. He followed her inside. The kitchen at Ember and Oak was all stainless steel and organized heat, the kind of professional space that hummed with its own authority. Two line cooks looked up when Calvin walked in, then looked at Pamela, then back at Calvin with the particular blankness of people who had been told something in advance and were trying to be polite about it. "This is my husband," Pamela said, in the tone a person uses when they are explaining a piece of furniture. "He loves to cook. I figured we'd let him do what he does best tonight." One of the line cooks handed Calvin an apron without making eye contact. Calvin tied it on. He did not say anything. He found the cutting board, located the salmon fillets resting in a hotel pan near the reach-in cooler, and began to work. His hands knew what to do. They had always known what to do. He pressed 2 fingers against the fish to check its temperature, reached for the kosher salt without being told where it was, and settled into the rhythm that had been his since his mother first stood him on a step-stool beside her stove when he was 6 years old. The kitchen noise filled the space where words would have been. Brandon arrived 30 minutes later. He came through the front, naturally. Calvin could hear him before he saw him, that particular quality of entrance that announces itself, the laugh that carries through walls, the voice pitched for an audience, even when the audience is just 2 people. Brandon Keyes moved through the world like he was always slightly late to something important and was doing everyone a favor by showing up at all. He came to the kitchen doorway once, briefly, and looked at Calvin with the specific disinterest of a man who has already decided another man is not worth considering. He said, "Smells good?" to the room, not to Calvin. Then he put his hand on the small of Pamela's back and steered her toward the private dining room like she was something he had recently acquired. Keisha was already at the table when Calvin brought the first course out. She had her phone propped against the water glass at an angle that was almost subtle. Almost. She looked up when Calvin set the plate down and gave him a smile that had too many teeth in it, the kind of smile that is actually a performance for whoever is watching the recording later. "Calvin, baby," she said, "you really outdid yourself. This is so sweet of you." He didn't answer. He went back to the kitchen. The evening moved the way those evenings move, when everyone in the room knows the shape of what is happening, and only one person is expected to pretend otherwise. Brandon talked about his expansion plans. A fifth location, possibly Charlotte, possibly Nashville, he hadn't decided. He talked about a celebrity partnership he had in the works, something that was going to change the whole conversation around black-owned spirits in America. He said the word brand 11 times. Calvin counted without meaning to. At some point, Brandon reached into the leather bag beside his chair and produced a bottle. Dark glass, a small gold label, the design clean and deliberate, the kind of label that did not need to shout because what was inside had already made its argument. A Kosua gold. Calvin was at the kitchen pass-through when he saw it. His hands did not stop moving. He was plating the second course, dragging a spoon through the sauce with the same even pressure he had been using all evening. But something in the back of his chest went very still. He knew that label. He had seen it before, years ago, in a different context, in a different life. His father's voice over the phone, talking about a deal, a small Georgia company, something about distribution rights and a merger that Calvin had half listened to because he had never had much appetite for business talk. He had been 40 years old and tired from a long week, and he had said, "That's good, Pop," and changed the subject. He stood at the pass-through and watched Brandon hold the bottle up like a trophy. "This," Brandon said, "is what the future looks like." My connect came through. It came. "This label is about to be everywhere." Pamela smiled at him like he had just handed her the sun. Calvin went back to the stove. He finished the meal. He plated every course clean. He seasoned nothing wrong. When Pamela announced at the end of the evening, champagne raised, Keisha's phone pointed directly at Calvin's face, that she would be filing for divorce, and that she hoped they could all be adults about it. Calvin was standing near the kitchen door with a clean towel over his shoulder. He nodded once. He untied the apron and folded it over the back of a chair. He thanked the line cooks by name. He walked out through the service entrance, the same way he had come in, back past the dumpsters, back through the door with no handle on the outside. He drove home through Atlanta's Friday night dark, the radio off, both hands on the wheel. The city moved past his windows, and he let it go. The silence in that car was not the silence of a man who had been broken. It was the silence of a man who had just remembered something important. Something his father had told him once, a long time ago, that he was only now beginning to understand. To understand what happened at Ember and Oak that Friday night, you have to understand what the 22 years before it looked like. Calvin and Pamela Osei met in the summer of 2002 at a cookout in Decatur, the kind where somebody's uncle has been tending the grill since 10 in the morning, and the potato salad has been argued over for a decade. Calvin was 30 years old, quiet in a crowd, the kind of man who refilled your cup before you noticed it was empty. Pamela was 29, and even then she moved through a room like she was conducting it. She was sharp and beautiful and certain of where she was going. Calvin fell in love with her certainty. He thought it was strength. For the first few years it was a real marriage. They bought a house in southwest Atlanta, a brick ranch on a wide street with old oak trees, and they built a life inside it the way people do. Slowly, with small arguments and good Sunday mornings and a routine that held them like a frame. Calvin worked logistics management for a regional freight company, moving up steadily, not spectacularly. He was the kind of employee who solved problems before anyone knew there was a problem. He was not the kind of employee who made sure everyone knew he'd solved them. That distinction mattered more than he understood at the time. Pamela climbed faster. She had the gift of visibility, knowing which room to be in, which name to mention, which version of herself to present at any given moment. By 2008, she was a senior HR manager. By 2012, she was a director. By 2015, she had a professional circle that Calvin only partially belonged to, dinners where everyone traded titles like currency, and Calvin's title, when it came up, was received with the particular polite silence reserved for things that don't quite fit. She joined the auxiliary board at Greater Harvest Baptist. She joined a women's professional network that met monthly at a hotel downtown. She started wearing her hair differently, buying clothes that announced themselves, building a public self that was polished and impressive and increasingly separate from the man who came home to her every evening and cooked dinner because he genuinely loved to cook. Keisha had been a background presence for years, but somewhere around 2016 she became a fixture. Pamela's younger sister had always had opinions. Now she had an audience of one and a cause. Every gathering, every phone call, every quiet family dinner became an opportunity for Keisha to measure Calvin against some invisible standard and find him wanting. She did it with smiles, always with smiles, the kind that said she was just being honest, just keeping it real, just saying what everybody else was thinking. "Pamela works so hard," Keisha would say, in a voice that implied someone in the room did not. Calvin learned to let it pass the same way he let most things pass, with patience, with silence, with the steady internal certainty of a man who knew who he was, even when no one around him seemed interested in the information. He took early retirement in 2020. The freight company offered a package, and he took it, genuinely looking forward to the slower pace, the cooking projects, the long mornings. Pamela's response was a tight smile and a news story she told at parties, that her husband had decided to take some time for himself, delivered with the tone of a woman managing a gentle disappointment. She stopped introducing him by name at professional events. He became "my husband," said quickly, a subordinate clause, something to move past on the way to the next sentence. The cooking became the cruelest irony of all. Every Thanksgiving, every Easter, every birthday gathering, every impromptu dinner party Pamela arranged to impress someone from her professional circle. Calvin cooked it. He smoked the brisket and made the macaroni from scratch and stayed up the night before to prep the collards low and slow the way his mother taught him. And every time, without fail, Pamela accepted the compliments as though the food had simply appeared. "She always puts on a spread," people said. Calvin washed the dishes. He said nothing. His father, Clifton O.C., died in the spring of 2022. It was a quiet funeral, the kind that feels too small for the man being remembered. Clifton had been a man of few words and careful habits, a builder in the oldest sense of the word, someone who moved money and resources without advertisement. At the repast, a lawyer Calvin did not recognize pressed a card and a sealed envelope into his hand and said, "When you're ready." Calvin thanked him. He drove home. He put the envelope in the desk drawer in his home office and closed it, because he was not ready, and because grief does not operate on a schedule, and because he had learned his father's lesson about patience without fully understanding yet what it was preparing him for. The envelope sat there for 2 years, 18 months, before that Friday at Ember and Oak, Brandon Keyes entered Pamela's orbit at a corporate mixer downtown. Within 6 months, he was the main topic of Pamela's phone calls with Keisha. Within 9 months, Calvin knew, not from evidence, but from the particular quality of her absence, the way a person can be standing in the same room as you and already be somewhere else entirely. He said nothing. He cooked dinner. He waited without knowing what he was waiting for. By early 2024, Pamela had stopped wearing her wedding ring to work. She told Keisha in a conversation she did not know Calvin could hear through the kitchen wall that he had peaked in the warehouse and she had outgrown the whole situation years ago. Calvin turned the heat down under the pot so nothing would scorch. He stood at the stove and he breathed. What Pamela never thought to ask, and Calvin never volunteered, was what was in that envelope. The Saturday morning after the dinner at Ember and Oak, Calvin woke up alone in the house. Pamela was at Keisha's. The rooms were quiet in a way that felt less like emptiness and more like permission. He made coffee. He sat with it. Then he walked to the home office, opened the desk drawer, and picked up the sealed envelope that had been sitting there for 2 years. He turned it over in his hands for a moment. The weight of it, the slight formality of the wax seal his father had always used, a habit from another era that Calvin had teased him about once and now understood. He opened it. The letterhead read Meridian Trust and Estates with a Buckhead address and a phone number. Below that, a cover letter referencing a matter of inheritance and beneficial ownership, and a name, Osei Volta Distribution Holdings. Below that, a figure that Calvin read twice, then a third time, his coffee cooling beside him untouched. He put the letter down on the desk. He thought about his father's voice on the phone years ago, talking about a deal, a small Georgia company, distribution rights, something that was going to grow the right way if you just left it alone and let it work. Calvin had half listened. He had been tired and uninterested in the business details, and he had said, "That sounds good, Pop," and moved on. He thought about Brandon at the table, bottle raised, gold label catching the light. Something in the back of his chest moved, like a door that had been shut for a long time, shifting on its hinge. He picked up the phone. He dialed the number on the letterhead. It rang once. It rang twice. A woman's voice answered. Precise, unhurried, professional in the way of someone who had been expecting this call and had not given up on it. "Meridian Trust and Estates," she said. "This is Diane Okafor." Calvin said, "My name is Calvin Osei. I believe you've been holding something for me." There was a brief pause, not surprise, just the measured beat of a person choosing their first word carefully. "Mr. Osei," she said, and then corrected herself. "Calvin, I have been hoping you would call. There is quite a lot we need to discuss." What Calvin learned in that call would take 48 hours to fully understand, and it would change everything. Diane Okafor's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Peachtree Road, where the carpet was the color of charcoal and the windows looked out over Buckhead like the city had been arranged specifically for this view. Calvin arrived 10 minutes early. The receptionist offered him water, and he accepted it. He sat in a chair that cost more than his first car, and he waited the way he had always waited, without fidgeting, without performing patience, simply present. Diane came to the doorway herself rather than sending anyone. She was 57 years old, dressed in a charcoal suit that matched nothing by accident, and she moved with the specific economy of a person who had spent 3 decades making sure every word she said was the right one. She extended her hand, looked Calvin in the eye, and said, "I am very glad you called." She was not performing gladness. She meant it. Her office was orderly in the way of a person who worked with significant sums, nothing decorative that was not also functional, no clutter. A single framed photograph on the credenza that Calvin did not look at long enough to identify. She set a folder on the desk between them and opened it with the unhurried precision of someone who had been through this particular story many times in her head and was finally ready to tell it out loud. "Your father was a careful man," she said. Calvin said, "Yes." He structured this deliberately. The silence was not an accident, and it was not neglect. He wanted the asset to mature without interference and without attention. He was right to do it that way. She turned the first page of the folder toward him. "In 2001, your father acquired a 15% silent stake in a small import and distribution company called Osei Volta out of Macon, Georgia. At the time, the company held distribution rights for 2 West African spirits labels in the southeastern United States. It was a modest investment, roughly $400,000. Your father believed in the product, and he believed in the people running it. Calvin nodded slowly. He remembered fragments of those phone calls. In 2009, Volta expanded its distribution territory to cover the full continental United States and acquired the rights to a third label, a Ghanaian distilled blend called a Kosua Gold. She paused precisely there, watching him. In 2017, Volta merged with Volta Hospitality Group, a private holding company with interests across food service, beverage distribution, and hospitality real estate. The merger tripled the value of your father's original stake. His 15% converted to a proportional ownership position in the new parent entity. She turned another page. As of this calendar year, Volta Hospitality Group is valued at $72 billion. Your father's stake, passed to you as sole beneficiary of his estate trust, represents 34% of the parent entity. The room was very quiet. Calvin looked at the figure on the page. He read it the same way he had read the figure in the envelope, twice, then a third time, not because he didn't understand it, but because understanding something and believing it are two different operations, and his mind was performing both simultaneously. Diane let him have the silence. She did not fill it. After a moment, she turned to a second document, a subsidiary breakdown, 2 pages long, printed in a clean sans-serif font. Volta's distribution arm handles 61 active contracts with hospitality and food service accounts across the Southeast. She moved her finger down the list without hurry. Line item 7. Calvin looked where her finger rested. A Kosua Gold, exclusive distribution. Active contract holder, Keys. Hospitality Group, 4 locations, Atlanta, Georgia. Annual renewal window currently open. Renewal decision. Due 30 days from this past Monday. He read it again. Brandon Keys had been building his entire food and beverage empire on the back of a distribution contract held by Calvin's company. Every bottle of a Kosua Gold that moved through Ember and Oak's bar program, every case Brandon ordered for his side import business, every negotiation Brandon had conducted with his Connect in distribution, all of it flowed through a subsidiary that Calvin's inherited stake controlled. Brandon had been sending money upstream for years without knowing whose hand was at the top of the chain. He had raised that bottle in a toast. In Calvin's face. Diane let that land fully before she turned to the third document. There is one additional item I want to flag before we discuss options. She set the page in front of him with the same even care she had used for everything else. Your ownership position predates your marriage to Pamela O.C. by 11 years. The trust was structured and funded before you met her, and your name was designated as beneficiary at the time of the original instrument. Under Georgia law, inherited assets held in trust prior to a marriage are classified as separate property. Pamela's name appears nowhere in any document related to this trust. She looked at him directly. She has no legal claim to any portion of this. Calvin sat with that for a long moment. 22 years. Every dinner party. Every introduction where her voice dropped when she got to his name. Every gathering where he stood at the stove while she accepted the compliments. The ring she stopped wearing. The things she said about the warehouse. None of it had touched this. None of it had ever touched this. He looked up at Diane. When he spoke, his voice was the same voice it always was. Quiet even, unhurried. "What happens," he said, "if I don't renew?" Diane folded her hands on the desk. Her answer was precise, legal, and total. Diane's answer had taken 20 minutes to deliver in full. When she finished, Calvin sat with it for a long moment, then nodded once, the way a man nods when the last piece of a thing clicks into place and the whole picture becomes clear. He said, "When can we start?" They met again, Tuesday morning. Diane had a yellow legal pad on the desk and a pen uncapped beside it, but she rarely wrote anything down. The plan was not complicated. That was its power. It did not require manipulation or deception or anything that Calvin would have to be ashamed of later. It required only that he exercise rights he already held, in the order Diane recommended, at the time the law permitted. Everything else would follow on its own. The sequence was this. First, the non-renewal notice. Brandon's distribution contract with Volta Holdings was up for annual renewal, and the window was currently open. Standard corporate procedure allowed the majority stakeholder to instruct the distribution arm not to renew. No explanation required, no personal signature visible. A letter on Volta Holdings' letterhead sent via certified mail to Brandon's distribution representative, informing him that Key's Hospitality Group's exclusive distribution agreement for Akosua Gold and 2 affiliated labels would not be extended beyond the current contract term, 60 days of remaining supply. After that, nothing. Second, the celebrity partnership. Diane had already identified the liaison at Volta's marketing division. Calvin made the call himself, brief and businesslike, identifying himself by his ownership position for the first time in his life. He requested that the Akosua Gold celebrity campaign be placed on hold pending an internal ownership review. The liaison did not ask follow-up questions. The campaign, which Brandon had been quietly leveraging in investor conversations for 3 months, went dark before the end of the day. Social media posts scheduled for the following week were pulled. The press release draft was archived. Third, the divorce proceedings. Diane filed the amended asset disclosure on Wednesday afternoon. It was a routine legal document required by Georgia family law, listing all assets held by either party relevant to the division of marital property. Calvin's name, Osei Volta Distribution. Holdings, 34% beneficial ownership. Current entity valuation, $72 billion. Classified as separate property under Georgia statute, predating the marriage by 11 years. Pamela's legal team would receive it within 72 hours. Diane said this with the same tone she used for everything else, measured, precise, without theatre. Calvin appreciated that about her. She understood that the facts were dramatic enough on their own. He went home Thursday morning and moved out with the same economy he had brought to everything else in his life. He packed 2 bags, clothes, his father's watch, a small framed photograph of Clifton Osei standing in front of a building Calvin now understood differently than he had as a child. He took his cast-iron skillet, the one that had been seasoned over 20 years and belonged to no one else. He left the kitchen clean. He left the refrigerator stocked. He left the apron, Pamela's gift to him 3 Christmases ago, white cotton with a small monogram she'd chosen as a joke, folded over the back of the kitchen chair where he'd always kept it. He did not take it. He left it there like a period at the end of a sentence. He did not call his friends. He did not call the deacons from Greater Harvest Baptist, or his cousin Raymond in Macon, or the 2 men from his old logistics team he still had lunch with twice a year. He did not tell anyone what was coming, not because he was ashamed, and not because he needed to protect the plan. The plan was already in motion and nothing could stop it now, but because his father had taught him something about the difference between justice and performance. Justice didn't need an audience. Justice just needed to be done. Sunday morning he put on his good suit and drove to church. He shook hands in the parking lot. He sang the 2nd hymn louder than usual, not because he was performing joy, but because something in his chest had genuinely loosened, like a knot that had been pulled tight for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. He ate the potluck after service, someone's macaroni, someone's pound cake, a paper plate balanced on his knee, while he talked to the deacon about nothing important, about the weather turning and the parking lot needing repaving, and a good kind of nothing that settled around him like familiar weight. Nobody asked about Pamela. He did not offer. On the drive home, he took the long way, the route that passed down the block where Ember and Oak sat with its clean signage and its outdoor planters and its front door that he had never been invited to use. He drove past it at a steady 30 miles an hour. He did not slow down. He did not look away from the road. He simply drove. The certified letter arrived at Brandon's distribution office the next morning. The letter arrived on a Monday. Brandon's distribution representative signed for it at 9:47 in the morning and had it on Brandon's desk by 10. Brandon read it once fast, then again slow, the way people read things they don't want to understand. Keys Hospitality Group, non-renewal of exclusive distribution agreement, Akosua Gold, and affiliated labels, effective end of current contract term, 60 days. He called the number on the letterhead immediately. A Volta Holdings operator answered, calm, professional, no name offered. Brandon asked for his contact, the person he always dealt with, the one who had shaken his hand at a trade conference 2 years ago and told him the relationship was solid. The operator said that individual was no longer the point of contact for this account. Brandon asked who was. The operator said that information was not available at this time. Brandon asked why the contract was not being renewed. The operator said she was not able to speak to the specific basis for the decision. Brandon raised his voice. The operator remained calm. The call ended. He tried 3 more numbers over the next 2 hours. None of them escalated. Volta Holdings was a $72 billion entity, and Brandon Keys was one line item in a subsidiary spreadsheet, and the machine had simply stopped moving in his direction, and there was no door to bang on because there had never been a face attached to the power, just a contract, and now the contract was ending. He didn't know it yet, but there was no door, there was only Calvin. By Wednesday, the celebrity campaign was officially dead. The influencer posts that had been teased, 3 posts across 2 major accounts, combined reach of 4 million followers, were quietly pulled without explanation. The press release that Brandon had been polishing for 6 weeks, the one that was going to announce the partnership and reposition Akosua Gold as the premium spirits choice of a new generation, was archived without being sent. Brandon called the campaign manager. The campaign manager said the decision had come from ownership. Brandon asked, which ownership? The campaign manager said he wasn't at liberty to say. Brandon called Pamela that night in a voice she had never heard from him before. His lead investor called Thursday morning. The investor's name was Gerald Whitmore, a private equity man out of Alpharetta, who had committed $2.4 million to the Ember and Oak expansion, locations 3 and 4 in Buckhead and Midtown, both in build-out, both projected to open within 90 days. Gerald had committed on the strength of the celebrity partnership. The Akosua Gold deal was the anchor of the whole narrative. Without it, the story didn't hold. Gerald called an emergency meeting for Friday. It lasted 40 minutes. Gerald pulled the funding. Both locations closed before they opened. The build-out crews were sent home. The signage that had already been installed was taken down. The local food press picked up the story within the week, a brief item on a hospitality industry blog, then a longer piece in the Atlanta Business Chronicle. Ember and Oak expansion collapses amid distribution dispute. Brandon gave no comment. There was nothing to say that would not make it worse. Calvin read the Chronicle piece over his morning coffee at his rental apartment off Metropolitan Parkway. He read it twice. Then he set the paper down and finished his eggs. Pamela's world came apart on a different morning, 1 week later. Her attorney called her at 8:15 on a Tuesday, before she had gotten to the office. The call lasted 6 minutes. The attorney's voice had the particular flatness of a professional delivering information they have had to read 3 times themselves before calling. Osei Volta Distribution. Holdings, beneficial ownership Calvin Osei. Ownership stake 34%. Current entity valuation $72 billion. Asset classification separate property, predating the marriage by 11 years. Pamela's legal claim to any portion of the trust, 0. Pamela sat in her car in the parking deck of her office building and did not move for 20 minutes. Then she called Keisha. Keisha's response was immediate and loud, all outrage and disbelief, and somewhere in that conversation, Keisha pulled up the video she had filmed at Ember and Oak, Calvin at the stove, Calvin setting the plates, Pamela's announcement, Keisha's own laugh bright and mean in the background. And she sent it to the family group chat with a caption meant to be funny, meant to be a companion to the story of how Pamela was about to clean Calvin out in the divorce. By the following morning, someone had screenshotted it. By that afternoon, it had moved out of the family chat and into wider circulation, traveling through the particular network that Atlanta's professional and church communities share, gaining context as it moved. Because by then the news of Brandon's collapse was public, and people were putting pieces together, and the video of Calvin being handed an apron in a restaurant he unknowingly controlled was not funny anymore. It was devastating to Keisha, to Pamela. The following week, Pamela's attorney confirmed what she already knew was coming. She had co-signed the lease on Brandon's flagship Ember and Oak location 18 months earlier, at Brandon's request, to demonstrate her commitment to his vision. $340,000 in remaining lease obligations. Her name was on the document. There was no ambiguity and no escape. Brandon stopped returning her calls on a Wednesday. She found out through a mutual contact that he had taken a consulting trip to Houston and had not announced when he was returning. Pamela was sitting at Keisha's kitchen table when her attorney called again, that same flat voice delivering the final piece. "The trial date has been set," he said. She held the phone against her ear and said nothing. Calvin has one thing left to do before that date. Pamela arrived first. She came through the front door of Ember and Oak with her attorney beside her, a man named Terence Broyles, who carried a leather portfolio and wore the expression of someone who had read the asset disclosure and understood exactly how this meeting was going to go. Pamela had dressed carefully. Blazer, heels, the kind of outfit that said she still had her bearing, still had her composure, still had something to stand on. She sat at the center table in the empty dining room and folded her hands and waited. The restaurant was largely dark. A few lights on over the bar, the afternoon sun coming through the front windows at a low angle, catching the dust that had settled since the kitchen went quiet. The tables were bare, the planters by the door still had greenery in them, but nobody had watered them in 2 weeks, and they showed it. Ember and Oak, flagship location, still under lease, still technically open in name, but the life had gone out of it like air from a room when a window closes. Calvin arrived 8 minutes later with Diane. He was dressed simply. Dark trousers, a grey button-down, no tie. He did not look like a man coming to negotiate. He looked like a man who had already finished what he came to do, and was here only to say so in person. Diane took a seat. Calvin pulled out his chair, sat, and looked across the table at Pamela with the same steady, unreadable expression he had worn in this building the last time he was here. Standing at a prep station, holding a knife, watching Brandon raise a bottle of Akosua Gold and toast the woman who was about to ask Calvin for a divorce. Terence Broyles opened his portfolio and began to outline a settlement framework. Calvin let him finish. Then he said quietly, "I didn't come to negotiate." Terence paused. Pamela's eyes moved to Calvin's face. Calvin leaned forward slightly and rested his hands flat on the table, and when he spoke next, his voice had the particular quality of a man who has been silent for a very long time and has finally decided that silence has done its work. "You brought me in through the service entrance," he said. "You handed me an apron in front of Brandon's staff, told them I was someone who loved to cook, like that was the whole of me, like 22 years of mornings and dinners and every holiday I spent on my feet in a kitchen so you could take the credit, like all of that was just a hobby I had." Pamela said nothing. "I stood at the pass-through that night and I watched Brandon raise a bottle, dark glass, small gold label." Calvin's voice did not rise. It did not need to. "Akosua Gold. I knew that label, Pamela. I'd heard my father talk about it years ago, about a company out of Macon, about distribution rights, about something he was building quietly because that was how he built things. I hadn't thought about it in years. And then there it was, in the hand of the man you brought to replace me, in a restaurant you used to put me to work in. He let that sit. I opened the envelope 2 days later. The one from the lawyer that had been in my desk drawer for 2 years because I wasn't ready to deal with it after my father passed. Richest Volta Distribution Holdings, 34% beneficial ownership, $72 billion entity. My name, not yours. Mine. Predating our marriage by 11 years. And line item 7 on the subsidiary distribution list. You want to guess what that was? Pamela's jaw was tight. Brandon Keyes had been sending money upstream to my company every time he ordered product, every case, every contract cycle, every time he told you about his connect in distribution and made himself sound like a man with real backing. He was paying me, Pamela. He just didn't know it. And neither did you. He looked at her directly. You spent 22 years treating me like I peaked the day I stopped clocking in at the freight company. Like I was something to manage and minimize and apologize for at parties. You brought me in through the back door of a building that exists, that has a lease, that had investors, that had 4 locations across this city, because of contracts my company controlled. You handed me an apron inside something I owned. He paused. You told Brandon I was better in the kitchen than anywhere else. What you didn't know, Pamela, is that the bottle he brought to your table, the one he built his whole business around, I own the company that put it in his hands. He's been paying me while sleeping in my house. The room was completely still. Pamela said, her voice cracking at its edges. You did this on purpose. Yes, Calvin said. You waited? Yes. She stared at him. The composure she had maintained for 22 years, the poise, the performance, the perfectly managed surface of a woman who always knew which room to walk into and how to walk out of it, left her face all at once, like something that had been held under pressure, finally releasing. She did not scream. She did not collapse. She simply came undone, quietly, in a way that was somehow more devastating than any dramatic breakdown could have been. Her eyes filled, her shoulders dropped, the blazer that had been meant to say she still had something to stand on no longer said anything at all. Calvin stood. He buttoned his jacket. He looked around the dining room one last time, the bare tables, the low light, the planters dying quietly by the door. The remaining lease on this building, he said, is being transferred to a non-profit. They're going to teach kids from the West Side how to cook here. He paused. Real cooking, the kind that doesn't need an audience. He walked out through the front door. The judge's ruling came 11 days later. The judge's ruling took 11 days and ran to 14 pages. Calvin read it once, set it on the kitchen counter of his rental apartment, and made himself a cup of coffee. Pamela received what was legally hers, her salary, 22 years of it accounted for, her contributions to the household acknowledged and fairly valued, her car, her personal savings accounts, the furniture she had selected for the house on the southwest Atlanta street with the old oak trees out front. The court was thorough and the court was fair, and the court also confirmed in clear language on page 9 that the Richest Volta Distribution Holdings Trust was separate property predating the marriage, and no portion of it was subject to division. The trust was untouched. Calvin signed the final documents on a Thursday morning at Diane's office. He used his father's pen, a heavy silver thing Clifton O.C. had carried for 40 years, and he set it down after the last signature and looked at it for a long moment. Diane slid the folder closed. She said, "It's done." Calvin nodded. They shook hands. He walked back out into the Buckhead morning and drove home through the kind of Atlanta traffic that doesn't care what just happened to you, which was exactly what he needed. Pamela took a regional transfer 3 weeks after the ruling, Charlotte. She requested it herself, a lateral move, same title, different city, and her company processed it without question because HR directors who request lateral transfers after public professional collapses do not tend to explain themselves in detail, and nobody pressed her. She packed the house on the southwest Atlanta street, loaded a moving truck, and left on a Tuesday in March without a goodbye that anyone in their community circle received. Calvin heard about it through the deacon's wife, who mentioned it in passing after Sunday service, not unkindly. He said, "I hope she's well," and meant it. Keisha's situation resolved itself the way those situations do in close communities, not through confrontation, not through any action Calvin took, but through the simple weight of what people had seen and what they had come to understand. The video she had filmed at Ember and Oak made its full circuit through Greater Harvest Baptist's extended network over the course of 6 weeks. People watched it and they drew their own conclusions about a woman who films her sister's husband being handed an apron as though it were entertainment. The auxiliary board did not hold a formal vote. There was simply a conversation, and then there was a vacancy, and Keisha's name was not on the new roster when it was posted in the church bulletin. Nobody called Calvin about it. Nobody needed to. He had said nothing. He had done nothing. Some things correct themselves. The Osei Culinary Institute opened on a Saturday in April, 6 months after the night at Ember and Oak that had started everything. The same dining room, the same kitchen, the same address, on the street in southwest Atlanta, where Ember and Oak had run its flagship. But the light inside it felt entirely different, the way a room does when it finally becomes what it was always supposed to be. Volta Holdings' community arm funded the full renovation. New equipment in the kitchen, professional grade, 16 stations, a program for youth from the West Side, ages 14 through 18, 2 cohorts per year. In the entryway, framed and hung at eye level, was a portrait of Clifton Osei. It was a photograph Calvin's cousin had found, Clifton in his 40s, standing in front of a building in Macon, squinting slightly against the sun, the beginning of a smile on his face that suggested he knew something the photographer didn't. Calvin had chosen it himself. He looked at it every time he came through the door, and he felt, each time, the particular satisfaction of a son who has finally understood his father's lesson completely. At the opening event, the room filled with people from the community, church families, neighbors, city council members, a few journalists, young people in chef's whites who had already completed their first week of training and were standing near the kitchen door with the careful pride of people who are new to something and already know it matters. Calvin moved through the room shaking hands, accepting congratulations with the same modest deflection he applied to everything, staying no longer at any one conversation than necessary. Near the end of the evening, a woman introduced herself by the dessert table. Her name was Imani Foster. She ran a youth cooking program on the West Side, had been running it for 7 years out of a church basement with donated equipment and a budget held together with determination. She had come to the opening because she wanted to see what a properly funded version of what she did every day looked like. She spoke directly, asked real questions, and laughed with the ease of someone who had nothing to prove to anyone in the room. She asked Calvin if he had cooked tonight. He said he had made the pound cake. She said she could tell. He smiled, a real one, not the managed kind. They talked for 20 minutes and exchanged numbers, and neither of them made it into anything larger than what it was, which was a conversation between two people who had both spent years doing good work quietly, finally standing in the same room. 6 months later, Calvin was back at Sunday service at Greater Harvest Baptist. Someone asked him what he had been up to. He said, "Just cooking." He ate the potluck. He drove home through the wide Atlanta streets with the radio on low. An old gospel station his father had loved, the kind that plays the same 10 songs in rotation, and somehow it never gets old. He changed clothes when he got home. He tied on his apron, His own, the plain one that had never been a joke, that had never been handed to him by anyone. And he stood at his stove and he started dinner. Here is what Calvin Osei understood that Pamela never did. A man who knows his worth does not need to announce it. He does not need to raise his voice or defend himself at the table or argue with people who have already decided what he is. He simply stops allowing others to set the table for him. And when the moment comes, when patience finally becomes power, he does not perform his victory. He just cooks, steady, unhurried, exactly as he always was. Now, what would you have done in Calvin's position? Would you have walked away quietly like he did? Or would you have said something that night at the restaurant? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. If this story moved you the way I think it did, hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second and it helps more people find stories like this one. And if you are not subscribed yet, make sure you do that before you go, and because we drop stories like this multiple times every week and you do not want to miss what is coming next. I will see you in the next one.